So to conclude this first lecture, I'll briefly introduce some materials for our consciousness research and then practical guide. Okay. So, building theories and collecting all these experiments and then making a decision about, or, making a really critical experiment to decide A or B is going to be, fascinating and also, fantastic on its own. However, as a practical student of consciousness research, I think you need to go through one step by step. Okay. So in practice, starting from your own phenomenology is always good, because if you get to the data first, then you may lose the motivation, or you may lose the sight of why are you doing this study in the first place. So spending some time on the visual illusions that I listed earlier, or think about consciousness from your own phenomenology wise, is first place to start. And then discover what you don't know, and then confirm the boundary of the knowledge. This might slide on the website is quite useful as a even general guide to the PhD. So I would recommend you to go through it by yourself. But imagine this circle is the boundary of the human knowledge, and then by the time you get born, then you don't know much. But as you grow older and so on, you start to increase and also catch up with the knowledge sphere. And then by the time of the bachelor degree, then you start to specialize, like here. And then master degree, you are deepening. And then research articles make it even probably narrower. And then about to start to get to the knowledge boundary. Okay. And then if you magnify this, you will see that you understand, okay, up until here, as a human being, we know something. And then from there on, it becomes blurry or unclear. And then, if you can make solid, a contribution to make a bulge onto this boundary, that's what it's called as a PhD. And also, because now the life expectancy is so long, and you don't need to think about that, you can only do one thing through your lifetime. But I would say that this kind of bulge can be made in many different areas, and sometimes unexpected things happens when you combine this kind of activity through multiple places, and that's called the interdisciplinary approach. And that's something that you will also learn, or get the sense through the lecture as well. So sometimes multiple bulge can make a huge difference, and that's most interesting kind of aspects. And also some breakthrough comes from this. All right, so come back. So in practice, after doing this kind of conceptual work, reading to literature up to the date, and then to propose a new experiment to make a bulge onto the human sphere of knowledge, that's in practice most effective to drive the field of consciousness research. And then based on the theoretical prediction, and then also if you're technology driven, then learning about the new equipment or new analysis technique also will drive this kind of progress. So there are, I can imagine only progress, but not the the progress into the future of consciousness research, basically. And then also effective thing is to combine ideas and also change conditions, doubt assumptions, refine the experiments to revisit many different things. So for example, in consciousness research, there has been, it's a relatively young field, but many of the experiment has kind of traditional assumptions. Let's say, you need a verbal report to understand what the other people are feeling. But is it really the case? Or you have an assumption that during the sleep, especially non-REM sleep, you may have heard, when you are not moving your eyes, you don't dream. But is it really the case? So this kind of thing, when you are reading introduction or background material of all these papers, there is an traditional assumptions and traditional kind of ideas, influential ideas. But if you start to doubt that, then you may be disliked by other people, but it has a big chance of proposing new ideas or reversing the wrong assumptions, wrong conclusion from the previous literature, and then to find the new things. So that's another practical kind of advice for the future. And then also conducting experiments or analysis or theoretical simulations. So in terms of learning of the boundary of the knowledge, there are many things that we can do, but effectively, most effective kind of classes of the experiments or simulation or theoretical thoughts comes from these kind of things like brain injury patients, or characterization of the phenomenology, or thinking about the relationship between attention and consciousness, or non-conscious behavior, or consciousness in animals. How can we actually become confident about them, or intracranial recordings in humans? And so how do we how does the change of the brain affects on the consciousness? Many things are unknown in this area of the research. And each of them has a potential, huge breakthroughs. And then, learning or terminology will always help to understand and to get to the sort of the boundary of the research. So this is just a couple of terms from the glossary of Christoph Koch's book. But many Wikipedias and other resources are useful. And then before the end of this lecture, I'll just introduce a bit of the basics on the neural-based consciousness. And this is, for example, gross anatomy of the 4 lobes of the brain that I'm going to refer to many times. Frontal lobe, just behind the eyes, is involved in the decision making and impulse control and judgment and emotion and control and so on. Temporal lobe, the both sides of the brain, this green thing, is involved in language or sexuality, emotion, hearing, and memory. Hearing is definitely in this area. On the other hand, the occipital lobe, the back of the brain here, is mostly related to the vision. And the parietal areas at the top of the brain here, as you saw, it's related to navigation or attention and movement and somewhat sensory perception and so on. And towards lecture 10, 11, I talk about the cerebellum and how they are unlikely to be part of consciousness, but it's the back of the brain. Surprisingly, there are 4 times more neurons in this structure than the neocortex altogether. Okay, so cerebellum is extremely deeply packed and complex, but most likely does not give rise to or support consciousness. And then also, if you're interested in MRI, especially, there's a couple of the important terminology, like anterior, that's a frontal part of the brain, versus posterior, the back of the brain, or lateral, both sides, versus dorsal. This one, lateral versus medial. It's a center is a medial or side, lateral, and also top of the brain, that's a superior, or dorsal. Dorsal is basically also the back of the side, the body compared to the stomach side, body inner side, and then that kind of extends, to this side. So ventral side corresponds to this lower part of the brain as well as the front part of the body. The dorsal is the back of the body, and then upper part of the brain. So these anatomical, term is important to understand and get familiar. And then finally, neurons. So each part of the brain contains lots of neurons. This is just 300 micrometer. So 1 millimeter would correspond to roughly like this size. Okay, and then each of the cortical layers are composed of roughly like 1 millimeter to 2 millimeter depth, and then consists of many similar kind of type of the neurons clustered within the horizontal slice called the layer. And the layer 4 tends to receive the inputs from the other areas, and then layer 1 tends to have only the connections, and then 2, 3, and also 5, 6 has distinct kind of functions. That's the sort of the cortical layers of the microcircuit of the brain. And then neurons. And each of the neurons, this is a very schematic kind of thing and very different from the reality, but as a first approximation, it's okay. Neurons are composed of the cell body called soma, and then this dendrite. This dendrite is receiving side, input comes into dendrite, and then when the electrical voltage exceeds certain certain level, then it starts to generate some kind of pulse of the electrical activity, and then that travels along this long cable called the axon. And then when it reaches to the terminal, then that produces some kind of chemical thing which is connected to other neurons dendrite here. And then this interaction is called a synaptic interaction. So basically, when the neuron fires, through its cable of axons, electrical pulse travels, and then at the end, it transforms the electrical into the chemical, and then that one goes on into the next neuron and so on. And importantly, there's no consciousness or information itself is kind of transferred in itself. It's electrical and the chemical interaction. And from this, or from the traditional kind of view, from this collection of the activity, consciousness results, or from IIT's perspective, some kind of activity along this line is supporting the parts of our experience in particular way. That's it for this week's lecture. See you next week.